from various churches and in the community, so welcome. I'm Gigi Miller, a member of St. Philip's Lutheran Church in Wilmington, and a member of our relatively newly formed anti-racism task force. My husband, who is a semi-retired, now interim pastor, served at St. Stephen's Lutheran Church back in 2009. That's where we met Bob and Sue Linderman. Bob being a member of St. Stephen's and Sue a member of Westminster Presbyterian. We quickly became friends and shared many dinners and gatherings together. On one such evening, Sue shared with us her passion of history and especially the history of people of color in this country. She has studied and done research for many years. I know you will be enriched and enlightened by Sue's presentation. Now I would like to introduce our moderator for today, the Reverend Patrick Downs, Senior Pastor of St. Philip's.
Hey everyone, great to have you guys here. As Gigi said, this has been one of the projects that we've been undertaking at St. Philip's, just to do a lot of learning and discussion and trying to reshape kind of our thinking surrounding racism in our country and everything. So thank you, Sue, for doing this, and Gigi for setting this up. I get to be the heavy today. All I do is sit in the background and make sure everything runs well for everybody. Couple of things: we are recording all of our classes. What that means is that if you have to leave early or you have to miss a class, they're going to be up on our website for St. Philip's. If you go onto our website, stphillips.us, we have a whole section under serving others, and anti-racism is one of them. If you go under that, you'll find the videos, no problem. Always email me and Gigi. We can also find them for you as well. So all of the classes that we have this month, right through the end of March when this ends, will all be recorded. You all will be, we're going to ask everybody to put their computers on mute. You were muted when you came in. For the sake of being able to chat, because it's always great to see people across congregations, especially since many of us know each other. I haven't seen Sue Loney in months and months and months, so it's great to see her in this, as well as many others. Sue has asked us to hold all of our questions till the end of our presentation today. She will leave space at the end to ask questions. You can leave them in the chat, or if you have never used the function before, you can raise your hand at the end, and instead of doing it like this, if you were in my class earlier today, we did it like this. We have too many people to see all on one screen at any one time. So I won't be able to see you waving, and nor will Sue necessarily, because I think I only have 20 of the 75 people in this class. So there is a function at the bottom. If you have a computer, at the bottom of your screen, there's a little button that says reactions. If you click on that, you'll see there's another button that says raise hand. And if you do that, then it actually puts a little hand in the corner, like Kevin just showed us. There's a little hand that appears right in there. If you look at Kevin Loney, he's got his hand raised right now, just to show us. That way we know what's going on. I can flip between screens and call on you, or Sue can call on you. If you raise your hand accidentally, you can click it again and it will turn off. If you're on your phone, that function is down, I think, in the lower right corner of your phone. The three little berries are there, three little dots, three little berries, I call them. I think if you click on that, then it'll open up the ability to raise your hand. And then we'll get to your questions all at the end. Sound good? So I'm going to ask you guys to mute right now. If you come out of mute, then I have a special place that I put you called purgatory. Just leave yourself on mute, and I'm going to turn it over to Sue to take it away.
It says Catholicism's coming up.
Patrick, if you want, you can mute all. Then that means that everybody doesn't have to find that button themselves. I see there's still some people not muted, and so you can do mute all. And what that does while we're recording is whoever is speaking, their picture appears next to the screen share. And so if you're not muted and you cough or the dog barks, you're going to be recorded as the speaker, which you may or may not want to have happen. Okay, well, let's get started. My name is, you now know, is Sue Linderman, and I am so grateful for the opportunity to share this time with you as together we explore racism in America, the history we didn't learn in school. I grew up in Wilmington, graduating from Mount Pleasant Public High School before I went on to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science at Mount Holyoke College. My 27-year career with the DuPont Company in Wilmington culminated with the spinoff of its medical X-ray business via a leveraged buyout that created Sterling Diagnostic Imaging, of which I was its first president. I'm especially proud of the long-term R&D investment by my business that developed a selenium array for image capture that is now at the heart of virtually every mammography machine in the United States. I am one of the co-founders of Westminster's Peace and Justice Work Group that was formed in the spring of 2018 with the twin goals of combating violence in Wilmington and promoting racial justice. The work group is affiliated with a number of community organizations, the Delaware Center for Justice, the Coalition to Dismantle the New Jim Crow, and Smart Justice Delaware, among many others. I grew up in a virtually all-white environment. Until I left for college, the only Black person I knew was our mailman, Mr. Brown. Then I found myself on a multiracial campus at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, 1963 to 1967. My experiences there launched a journey that continues to this day. I've had a lifelong interest in history and was a political science history major in college, yet I didn't discover till 3 or 4 years ago that I was missing a significant portion of our country's history. In my experience, American history classes covered the Pilgrims, the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and a bit of Reconstruction with those darn carpetbaggers. And it picked up again sometime around World War II. It was the series of police shootings of unarmed Black men in recent years that galvanized me to develop a better understanding of how we got to where we are. What I learned is that much of the racial turmoil in our country today can be traced directly to elements of our history, even before the founding of the United States. Many of the racial stereotypes that we hear or hold are a direct consequence of intentional public and economic policy and biased beliefs that have no grounding in genetics. Other countries with similarly sordid racial pasts have sought to move forward by a process called truth and reconciliation. America is in desperate need of such a process. So we here for these 6 weeks will embark on a search for more truth. Much of it is painful, especially for those of us who profess to believe that every person is a child of God, and who believe that we are good people who seek justice and peace for all. I believe that in bringing to light this history of ours that we should have known but didn't, we may be transformed in deeply meaningful ways with a new or renewed urgency to act, to finally and truly address the profound inequities that exist in our society today. So let's get started. Our purpose in these 6 weeks is to develop a better knowledge, a better understanding of our country's racial history. We have a legacy of racial inequality grounded in the enslavement of millions of Black people, followed by decades of terrorism and racial subordination through public policy and cultural attitudes. As we go through this material, I'm going to be using a variety of terminology: African, slave, African American, Black, Black people, people of color. Sometimes the terms will come from direct quotes, but in every case, I'll seek to be faithful to the time period and the context in the terms that I use. We have a 6-part class. Today, we focus on the early years, from 1619 to the Civil War and into Reconstruction. The next week, the focus is slavery by another name, one of the least known periods of our history. Bryan Stevenson, whom you may know, the author of Just Mercy, founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, has famously said that slavery did not end in 1865, it evolved. And we will see the beginnings of that evolution next week. Then we move into the 20th century with various elements of public policy and the civil rights movement. We follow that with the history of mass incarceration and the war on drugs, then voter suppression from the beginning up until today. And finally, where do we go from here? So we begin standing on a point of land in what was the colony of Virginia, near Jamestown. It's a hot summer day in August of 1619. And as we look east across the Atlantic toward Africa, a ship appears on the horizon. It has had a very difficult crossing, and it is in need of resupply. And so the colonists provide the captain and crew with the food and other supplies that they need. And they are compensated for these materials by receiving 20+ kidnapped Africans who are part of the cargo on the ship. And thus marks the beginning of the African people arriving in the British colonies. Initially, their legal status was servant. At the time, the primary crop in the area was tobacco. The cultivation was not terribly labor intensive, but it was very hard on the land. And as a consequence, the colonists kept looking for more land, more and more land to the west, because they could not keep planting more tobacco crops year after year in the same soil. And so the Native Americans suffered as the colonists took the land that they needed. But even with the relatively minimal worker needs that tobacco cultivation required, the colonists did not have the ability to perform those functions. And so they had begun by recruiting people from Central Europe to come over as indentured servants, with the contractual arrangement that these people would serve 4 to 7 years working the land. And at the end of that time, they would have their freedom, the ability to earn money on their own, and they would receive some land that they could farm themselves. It was at the end of the 30 Years' War in Central Europe, and there were many people who were in desperate need of work. And so quite a number flocked to the colonies to work as indentured servants. Now, these Europeans were covered by British common law. That meant that there were certain aspects of their work that had to be respected. And they were also, English common law also provided that as Christians, there were certain terms that had to be honored in their employment service. But English common law did not cover these new Africans. And in fact, in later years, even if the Africans were to convert to Christianity, laws were passed that said they weren't the same kind of Christians as those who had come from Europe. So the ship that brought these Africans to the New World as part of the transatlantic slave trade looked like this, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But first, over the course of the transatlantic slave trade, more than 20 million Africans were taken from their homes and were transported to the coast and loaded on board ships that looked like this. But even the trip to the coast was fraught with danger. Out of the 20 million Africans who were kidnapped, who were taken, only 10.7 million made it to the coast to be loaded on board these ships. The slaves were branded with hot irons, and they were restrained with shackles. Their living quarters was often a deck within the ship that had less than 5 feet of headroom. That's what you see in the center diagram. And throughout a large portion of the deck, as you see in the lower diagram, sleeping shelves cut this limited amount of headroom in half. Lack of standing headroom was the least of the slaves' problem. With 300 to 400 people packed in a tiny area, an area with little ventilation, and in some cases, not even enough space to place buckets for human waste, disease was rampant. So that the largest possible cargo could be carried, the captives were wedged below decks, chained to low-lying platforms stacked in tiers, with an average individual space allotment that was 6 feet long, 16 inches wide, and perhaps 3 feet high. Unable to stand erect or turn over, many slaves died in this position. In fact, of the 10.7 million Africans who began the journey, 2 million died before reaching shore. In fact, there are records from various voyages of sharks that would follow these ships, waiting for the corpses to be thrown overboard. The journey itself, called the Middle Passage, took between 21 and 90 days. It was called the Middle Passage because the first leg of the journey began in Europe, where goods were taken to Africa and traded for these people. The second leg to the New World took between 3 weeks and 3 months, depending on weather and the condition of the ship. And so it's almost inconceivable to imagine what that journey must have been like. And so as the Africans began appearing in the colonies in greater and greater numbers, work began in legislatures to institutionalize slavery, to make sure that these Africans would not be treated the same way as the indentured servants from Central Europe were. So by then there were Africans who had become indentured servants, but as these laws began to be passed in the colonies, they were all treated as slaves. The first colony to institutionalize slavery with the passage of laws was actually Massachusetts. And the last colony in 1750 was Georgia. And they began to distinguish between people of European and African descent. And for the first time in 1671, the first print reference to a group of people known as white appeared. Prior to that, there had been no such distinction of a group of people based on color. The laws determined that these Africans would be chattel slavery. They were property. They were owned, just like a horse or a pig or a dog or a house. And they had no rights. Their status as to whether they would be free or not was determined by their mother's status. So if their mother was a slave, she would be a slave her entire life, and her offspring would be slaves as well. And as I said, they could not be exempted from mistreatment by British common law by converting to Christianity. That distinction did not apply to the Africans. So as slavery began to be institutionalized in the North, most of the slaves functioned as house servants or as unpaid skilled labor. Many of these Africans brought great talent with them because they had been part of flourishing, functioning civilizations in their countries. And in the North, without the need for unskilled agricultural labor, many of the Africans served in the skilled labor that they had brought with them. But nevertheless, they were all relegated to a subhuman status. And so this new identification of race brought with it the myth of racial inferiority, which was a necessity to treating people as not people, particularly as the colonies began moving toward the creation of the United States of America and the belief in freedom of all people. And so the law provided that slaves were not allowed to learn to read or write. It was against the law. They were not allowed to marry. And families were often torn apart as members of the family, being treated as property, were traded and sold to other owners. But in opposition to this treatment of the Africans began to emerge in the North. They began to see that slavery was really not terribly efficient, and it was not socially accepted as they began thinking about freedom. And so laws began to change in the North, and they began to abolish the institution of slavery. And that process began in 1774, and by 1804, all of the northern states had reversed their laws about slaves. And during this time period, the US Constitution was written and ratified. Part of the Constitution provides for the Senate and the House of Representatives, and provides for the right for states to allow people to vote. But representation in the House of Representatives was dependent on population. And so the South very much wanted all of its slaves to be counted as population in determining representation. Conversely, the North did not want that to happen because it would disadvantage the northern states. And so the first of a series of consequential compromises was enacted in the Constitution, where it was decided that a slave would count as 3/5 of a real person. Native Americans counted as nothing. In fact, the only reference to Native Americans in our founding documents comes in the Declaration of Independence, where they are described as merciless Indian savages. Also included in the Constitution, reflecting beliefs of some of the founders that the African slave trade should come to an end, was a provision that said Congress could end the African slave trade, but not until at least 20 years had elapsed. And so basically, as soon as that time period was satisfied in 1808, Congress outlawed the importing of slaves, and the arrival of those hundreds of slave ships began to end. Not completely, not all at once, but the importation of slaves dramatically slowed. However, the plantations, particularly in the South, still had a need for workers. And so without being able to import new slaves, they embarked on a self-producing labor force. And this domestic trade was controlled by legalized violence and also by urging every female slave to bear as many children as possible. So during this time period, more than 1.2 million slaves were sold at auction, and families were split up. In fact, half of all slaves were separated from their spouses and their parents during this time period. As the auctions took place, the slaves were marched in chains, they were transported to the auction blocks, and they were held in pens waiting for their turn. Many of these slaves, as they were auctioned, moved from the upper South to the lower South, where they were worth more and where it was harder for them to escape to freedom. By 1860, Montgomery, Alabama had more slave trading locations in the city than churches and hotels put together. A representation of an ad for auction. For sale, Mary Jane, about 11. Because of course, these slave children didn't have birth certificates like regular people. Martha, about 10. Louisa, about 7. Priscilla, about 9. All children of Judy. Imagine being Judy. So we look at the economic imperative of slavery. As I mentioned initially, the primary crop in the colonies was tobacco, but the move to cotton occurred because the land had been exhausted and cotton was not as hard on the soil. The issue with cotton was that it was much more labor intensive. The harvesting of cotton took more people, and the actual conversion of that harvested good into fiber was extraordinarily time consuming. You had to pick apart all the little twigs and bolls and in order to turn it into the fiber that could be spun. But that changed in 1793 with the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney that mechanized that separation process. And as a consequence, the demand for cotton exploded. By the mid-1800s, cotton was the United States' major leading major export. So this tension continued between slaveholding and non-slaveholding states. And in 1820, the territory of Missouri asked to become a state. But there was a desire on the part of Congress to not have more slave-owning states. And so each needed to be balanced by the admission of a free state. That was part of the Missouri Compromise. And so in 1820, Missouri was allowed to join the Union, allowing for the ownership of slaves, and Maine was carved out of Massachusetts and was admitted as a free state. And that settled the matter for a little bit, but not forever. And in 1854, both Kansas and Nebraska wanted to join the Union, but they both allowed for the possibility of slave owning. And so the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed by Congress that said that individual states, upon joining the Union, could decide whether or not to allow the ownership of slaves based on popular sovereignty. And the history of Kansas in particular that's sprang from this decision is a fascinating one. For a period of time, Kansas had 2 legislatures and 2 governors, one that governed the slave owning perspective of Kansas and the other that governed the free perspective of Kansas. And in fact, this whole issue of the Kansas and Nebraska Act became the primary topic of the Lincoln-Douglas debates that took place when they were running for Senate. So a fascinating piece of history that we won't go into at the moment. But the tension continued, and in 1856, the Republican Party was formed, not in opposition to slavery, but in opposition to the spread of slavery. And then a monumental decision by the Supreme Court was handed down in 1857, known as the Dred Scott v. Sanford decision. Dred Scott had been a slave, lived in a slave-owning state in the South, but he traveled with his master to a free state. And then his master died, and Dred Scott sued to be allowed to be free. But the Supreme Court decision in 1857 is widely considered the worst decision ever rendered by the Supreme Court, although I would argue there have been a couple here lately that would vie for that distinction. In any case, the Dred Scott decision declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional because it violated the Fifth Amendment of depriving people of their property without due process. This decision further said that Blacks, whether slave or free, could never become citizens, and they had no federal rights. Chief Justice Taney, in writing the decision for the majority, said, "In the opinion of the court, the legislation and histories of the times and the language used in the Declaration of Independence show that neither the class of persons who had been imported as slaves nor their descendants, whether slave or free, were then acknowledged as a part of the people, nor intended to be included in the general words used in that memorable instrument, we the people." They had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. And so, from an economic standpoint, by 1860, 80% of the GDP of the United States was tied in one way or another to slavery. So we come to 1860, and there are 4 candidates for president, 3 Democrats and Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln is elected because of the divide within the Democratic Party. Within 3 months, 7 southern states secede, followed by 4 more, and then followed by Missouri and Kentucky. Now, there has been debate for about ever as to whether the Civil War was fought over slavery or over states' rights. And the reality is, it was fought over the states' rights to maintain slavery. If you wanted to make the case that the South seceded because of its desire to preserve states' rights, you'd only have to look at the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 that was enacted on behalf of the southern states, because the Fugitive Slave Act applied to all of the states, and it said that citizens were required to aid in the return of escaped slaves to their owners in the South. And if they refused to aid in that return, or they provided any assistance to slaves, they were to be fined and prosecuted. And so that was an application of a Southern desire opposite the states' rights of the northern states. But even more than that, if we look at the original documents, every one of the states that seceded had its legislatures pass articles of secession. Mississippi's read, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product, which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. These products are peculiar to the climate verging on the tropical zone. And by an imperious law of nature, none but the Black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. These products have become necessities of the world, and a blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. That blow has long been aimed at the institution and was at the point of reaching its consummation. There was no choice left us but submission to the mandates of abolition or a dissolution of the Union whose principles had been subverted to work out our ruin." And even more significantly, Alexander Stephens, who was the Vice President of the Confederacy, gave a speech on March 21st, 1861, that has come to be known as the Cornerstone Speech. And as the Vice President of the Confederacy said, "Our new Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institutions, African slavery as it exists among us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization." This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. The general opinion of the men of that day, that is the revolutionary period, was that somehow or other, in the order of providence, the institution of slavery would be evanescent and pass away. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite ideas. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. And 3 weeks later, the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter and the Civil War began. And the war raged on. Then in January of 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and it freed 4 million slaves in the 10 southern states that were still in rebellion. Tennessee had begun acting to return to the Union, and so the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to them. It also did not apply to Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, all states that allowed for the ownership of slaves. So the slaves in those states were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. And the war continued. The freeing of the slaves deprived the South of many of their workers. And ultimately, General Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox in April of 1865. By that time, there were 620,000 people dead and 1.5 million severe casualties out of a United States population of just over 9 million people. And so began a new period in our history known as Reconstruction. It was a new dawn. It was a pivotal period. It offered a glimpse of hope of a more perfect union with greater equity and representation. There were 3 amendments passed during this time period. The first was the 13th Amendment, passed, actually enacted by Congress in January before the war ended, and ratified in December of that year. And it abolished slavery, sort of. There's a loophole in the 13th Amendment that says that slavery is abolished except in the case as punishment for conviction of a crime. And we are going to see the implications of that loophole in all its glory next week. So the 13th Amendment was ratified in December, but all the states didn't ratify it by then. Delaware had to think about it for a while. And perhaps they thought that the turn of a new century would be a good time to acknowledge that, that slavery should be abolished. So Delaware ratified the 13th Amendment in 1901. Kentucky got around to ratification in 1976. Perhaps they've forgotten about it, I'm not quite sure. But bringing up the end was Mississippi. Mississippi ratified the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery in 2013. So imagine what it is to live in a state that until 8 years ago had not acknowledged that slavery had been abolished. Also in 1865, the Ku Klux Klan was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee, and its stated purpose was amusement. If you can classify as amusement men putting on robes and riding in horseback with firearms through Black communities in the dark of night as amusement. Andrew Johnson, who became president after President Lincoln was assassinated, was no fan of abolition, was no fan of equality. He opposed Black voting rights. He supported the Black codes and white supremacy. And in 1865, he pardoned 7,000 secessionists. These were people who expected that they would be imprisoned at least, if not executed for treason. But as the war came to an end, Johnson pardoned them. And in 1866, he rescinded all the land grants that had been made to former slaves, which forced them to turn to the economic system of sharecropping, which we will discuss more later. Then in 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts, the official start of Reconstruction, and it created 5 military districts for 10 states. and that act was passed for Congress over President Johnson's veto. The next year, the 14th Amendment was enacted that provided for citizenship and due process for former slaves. It allowed Black adult males to vote. The little ladies were going to have to wait a little longer. And it enabled them to hold office. In that election of 1868, voter turnout among Black males was more than 90%. And that year, Blacks were elected to 600 positions in state legislatures. They became the state executive in 18 states. The governor of Louisiana was elected, was a Black man. That was the last time that would happen until 1960. 18 US congressmen were Black and 2 US senators. But the pressure to keep Blacks from voting intensified. And so in 1870, Congress passed the 15th Amendment that said that the right to vote cannot be denied based on race, color, or condition of previous servitude. One of the other things that had been accomplished in these amendments was that the former Confederate leaders were barred from holding office, so that those who had led the states into secession and the start of the Civil War were barred from holding office. But the tide began to turn. Congress was wearying of the battle because the Southern representatives in Congress continued to fight to restore slavery. And so in 1872, Congress passed the Amnesty Act that restored full civil rights to the Confederate leaders, and that meant that they could once again run for and hold public office. And the Supreme Court began its assault on the legal architecture of Reconstruction. In the slaughterhouse cases, the Supreme Court ruled that the citizenship granted by the 14th Amendment only applied to federal citizenship. It didn't mean that you could be a citizen of your state. And the Cruikshank decision said that in protecting people from violence, it was only referring to state actions. It was only prohibiting personal violence against former slaves as enacted by the states, but not by individuals. And so it unleashed the power of organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and the Order of the White Camellias, and in fact, even individual actions against African-American citizens. And then in 1876, there was a deadlock in the presidential election between Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes. And so Congress and the Supreme Court worked out a deal where they would name Rutherford B. Hayes president if he promised to end Reconstruction and remove the federal troops. And he did, and they did. And Reconstruction came to an end. Federal troops were removed, leaving the Confederate leaders once again in power.
So Sue, are we open for questions here? Is that how you want to go?
Questions, comments,
Okay.
whatever.
So if anybody has a question or comment, they want to raise their hand. Yeah, I see Carol. If you want to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you so much, Sue. That was really a wonderful, quick capture of the history. And my only comment, and I put it in the chat, is that, of course, being quite aware of where we are today, how some things just don't seem to change, and the corruption of power that seems to exist. And I don't know if that speaks to humanity and our flaws, or the flaws of people who seek to be leaders. I'm not sure, but it's very deeply moving and sad. And that's it. Say no more.
Thank you.
Yeah, others. Susan Mack, I see your hand.
Oh, let me just start up my video. Hold on. Just a more specific question. You had mentioned something about the Emancipation Proclamation, and that and I missed some of that, like which states it applied to, which it didn't. Maybe you could just talk a little bit more about that. And,
Sure.
And why that was the case.
It applied to the states that were still in rebellion. So the original 7 states plus the next 4. One of those original 11 was Tennessee, and it was in the process of rejoining the Union. So it was not still in rebellion. And the reason, it's interesting, it has been suggested that the reason that Lincoln did not free the slaves in the border states was that he didn't want them, as a consequence, to join the Confederacy, even at that late date. But in reality, he was only able to free the slaves in the states still in rebellion because they were considered property of the enemy combatants. And so in terms of being able to take action to seize property during wartime, he could only enact something that would affect those slaves held in the states that were fighting the Civil War. Does that answer your question, Susan?
Yeah, that I hadn't heard that before. So then the states that were not covered by the proclamation, I mean, how were the slaves in those states treated in response to that then?
They were still held as slaves. They were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation.
So it was not until the 13th Amendment.
Not until the 13th Amendment, that's correct.
Huh.
So it was 2 more years, well, 2.5, 3 more years, right? Yep.
Interesting.
Any other questions from folks?
I have 2. One is, I think that there was slavery in Mexico and Texas prior to the arrival of slaves in 1619 in Jamestown. Am I correct on that?
There's the African slave trade began in 1619. There have been other examples of other groups of people who were subject to other forms or institutions of slavery. And there was slavery that existed in various other parts of the world. But in the context of African slavery in the colonies and the United States, that began in 1619 with the arrival of that ship.
And then the second thing has to do with the Emancipation Proclamation. Weren't the Blacks who could get to Union camps able to get freedom because they were in essence federal territory once they got to those Union places?
Linda, are you talking about before the Emancipation Proclamation was passed or after?
Well, I think that with the Emancipation Proclamation, they were able to do that, and then they were able to be accepted into the Union. So it was kind of a sleight of hand with the words.
I'm not sure about the term, but one of the things that did happen, quite a number of the freed slaves crossed over into Union territory. And actually, almost 180,000 of them served in the Union Army during the remaining years of the war. And of that 180,000 freed slaves, 40,000 of them were killed during the war. So the sacrifice was huge.
Pastor Sue Loney has her hand raised.
Thank you, Patrick. So Sue, thank you for doing this. I think it's appalling how much we didn't learn coming through school the first time through. I wanted to ask you about something you mentioned at the very beginning, and I've forgotten the year, but you talked about the beginnings of the construction of whiteness, the notion that there were white people as separate from African people. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that. It seems to me that that's something that that is redefined with each new wave of immigration over the centuries. And also, can you speak to how white indentured servants were, how they were treated differently than African enslaved people?
Sure. Going back to the issue of white versus Black, there was no delineation of white people anywhere in the world as a category of people before this process in the United States. And the first time the term white was recorded as being used to describe basically those who came from Europe was in 1671. And that began the delineation between white and Black. And prior to that, people pretty much only had the distinction of the country they came from. So you had Polish people and Italian people and German people, and but as this myth of racial difference began to grow as a justification for slavery and the treatment of the Africans, everyone who came from Europe gravitated toward the white leadership in the States. It was a way of distinguishing yourself from those other people. There's a wonderful PBS series called Race, the Power of an Illusion. And it points out that there is more genetic difference within what we call racial groups than there is among racial groups. So it is not grounded in genetics that there are racial genetic differences. Nevertheless, the power of the concept of race is overwhelming. So I think that was your first question. The indentured servants were all treated the same. Some of the early Africans who came over, particularly before the slavery laws were enacted, remained as indentured servants. Some of them indeed completed their term of indenture, 4 years, 7 years, got some land and their freedom. There were a few of those, and there were a few of those former Africans who became quite affluent in the system until the slavery laws were enacted. But once the laws determining and describing slavery were enacted, then the Africans were all treated according to who had not been freed, were all treated according to those laws, not able to read and write, not able to marry, not able to get birth certificates for their children, that their owners were able to sell them as they would any other piece of property. Does that answer your question?
I think so. So, and to be enslaved, that was a heritable condition. If
Yes.
you were, but to be indentured, that was sort of your, I don't know, your job, your occupation. That characteristic didn't pass on to your children.
No, the service of indenture was a contract, and
Yeah.
it had a defined time period that was typically either 4 years or 7 years. Slavery was the position of slavery was permanent, and it was inherited through the line of the mother. So any child of a woman who was enslaved was by definition a slave for life as well. Which is interesting because until when, women couldn't even own property. And yet it was the line through the mother that determined whether children were slave or free.
And so to something you talked about later, that's the terrible phenomenon of white masters enlarging their workforces by impregnating their female slaves.
Either directly themselves or ordering the male slaves to do the same.
Yeah.
Yep.
Are we the first nation to have invented the concept of permanent enslavement? Does that exist in other places?
It does not. Whether it ever did in all of history, I don't know. But ours was a unique system. And what we will learn later is that when the government was forming in Nazi Germany, they studied the United States and what we had done, both with slavery and with Jim Crow laws, to take some lessons on how they would architect their society during Nazi Germany. And we'll learn more about that later. And in fact, they rejected some of the provisions of Jim Crow laws as being too extreme for Nazi Germany.
Well, that says it all, doesn't it? Thank you very much.
Yep.
And I think Sue mentioned the PBS video. That actually, Phil Duncan might be able to help me with it later. That was on our resources pages under anti-racism on the St. Philip's website. We were just working on that last week. It might have gotten deleted, but keep your eye on that because we'll repost that. And Phil, if you're listening, maybe you and I can work on that this week to make sure that's available to people, because that video was actually very, very helpful. So I see Carol has her hand and then Anila.
Oh, yeah. This discussion is so interesting. I almost forgot I had my hand raised. And it was actually a tag along to the previous person before this who asked about the, I guess it was the laws. Well, I guess actually it was sort of Emancipation Proclamation, but really it had to do with that 13th Amendment thing that you mentioned about, which I'm going to say I actually taught U.S. history for a few years. My first career, I was a teacher. And that's one aspect of the 13th Amendment I never remember learning about, which was that slavery was abolished with exceptions. And so I was just curious. So you mentioned Delaware, Kentucky, and Mississippi didn't get rid of that exception piece. Is that what you meant by that?
No, they simply didn't ratify the amendment. The amendment went into effect without Delaware, Kentucky, and Mississippi ratifying it, but those three states just never said, yeah, we agree.
And so, but the exception clause is still there?
Absolutely.
Holy moly.
And we will talk about that next week, and we will talk about it when we get to mass incarceration. Yes, ma'am.
Goodness. Thank you.
Hi. My quick question actually comes as going back to when you said the African people who were indentured servants and were freed. Were they then later, when the slave trade came, did they have to worry about becoming enslaved or being arrested as escaped slaves, or did they actually live free?
Well, the answer to that was, it depends. I forget what was it 12 Years a Slave? The movie about the African American man who was basically kidnapped and sold into slavery, even though he was free. So it was not a get out of jail free card. You know, you still could be subject to the beliefs and behaviors that existed in your community.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Sue? Gigi's raising her own hand.
I have that little hand on there. So could you just share just a few minutes where you have gotten all your research? I believe you've even heard speakers. I remember you telling me.
Yeah, I said, you know, if I had tried to put together this course back when I was in college, I would have spent 8 years at the card catalog sitting on the floor in the library. Google is an amazing resource, and it takes you to a lot of original documents. It's not just articles that have been written, but I've read a zillion books. There are a zillion more to read. There are wonderful videos, podcasts, articles. And in reality, this class doesn't bear a whole lot of resemblance to where it began because there's so much more information now than I had when I started. There is just tons of material available if you go look for it. What's most extraordinary is that this is still not part of American history that's being taught in our schools. So it isn't just us who didn't learn this like a million years ago. Kids aren't learning it today either.
Thank you.
I feel sort of silly. Oh, I didn't raise my hand. Why isn't it though? I mean, it's just because, I mean, we just have racist leaders that we don't educate our kids with this. Like, what is holding us back from teaching this?
It's a couple things. My belief, history is written by the victors, and we're the victors. And so that's part of it. Part of it is that you did have to go look for it. Part of it is that the greatest influence on textbook generation comes out of the state of Texas, that even protested against including, noting that Hillary Clinton had been Secretary of State. They didn't want that included in the textbooks. So it is a question of who controls access to the information, who controls the production of the information. I've been in touch with the Red Clay School Board and offered to see if there isn't something that could be done as a seminar class or something, particularly for students in the high school, that would begin to expose them to some of this historical information. But there was a profound lack of response or interest to do that. I think we need to speak up, and I think we need to speak out at school board meetings and at other education forums to see if action can't be taken so that the next generation of students doesn't grow up as uninformed about this past as we did.
We have a question from Catherine Collard. Sue, are we okay on time?
I'm good if you are.
Okay, yeah, Catherine.
Sue, I assume you're going to talk about the Mississippi 2013 abolish slavery next week, maybe? Is that true?
No, it was just a reflection that they did not think it important enough to add their state's name to the list of states who ratified that 13th Amendment.
That's,
I will talk about other actions in the state of Mississippi. Absolutely, we're going to hear a lot about Mississippi as we go forward.
That's amazing to me, and not in a good way. But I wanted to make a comment about the last comment about school history and things that were taught, not about racism, but about women's rights and the right to vote, and how that began in New York State, and what I recently learned from another session through my alumni association was that the women in the tribes in New York State, in the Indian tribes in New York State, had quite a lot of rights within their tribe. And when women were not allowed to vote, they wouldn't agree to become citizens. And that their rights and their fight on that battle contribute a great deal to women's right to vote, which started in New York State, which I don't remember ever learning about. And I did study Indians when I was in school, so that was pretty interesting to me. So I think there's a lot that we're not taught in school. I've been doing a huge amount of reading about history of late because of it. So yeah, I think that it's time to really be able to teach our kids, and maybe we have to do it at home, I don't know. But you know, what really happened. It's interesting.
Yeah, and we had a conversation last night at dinner with our adult kids who said that they took American history several times in the course of middle school and high school, but they always learned the same things.
Right.
So it wasn't that they didn't spend the time on it. It was that the subject matter was just reiterative of the same, you know, Pilgrim, Revolutionary War, Civil War, and never amplified the information that they got.
Right. Thank you for doing this. I appreciate it.
Thank you for being here.
We have a message in our chat from Diana asking, what are the origins of the Ku Klux Klan in relation to the Emancipation Proclamation? I don't know if Diana wants to expand on that, take herself off mute to expand on that, or if that's enough for you, Sue.
Yeah, I'm not sure quite about the connection. The Ku Klux Klan was founded in all likelihood in reaction to the passage of the 13th Amendment that freed the slaves, because the loss in the war actually intensified the drive of the white Confederate leaders to continue to subjugate the African Americans. And so I believe that the formation of the Ku Klux Klan was most directly a response to the passage of the 13th Amendment.
Okay, anyone else? Any other questions? Any other thoughts? Okay, seeing none, I think that brings our time to a close. Sue, is there anything else you want to close with? Are you good?
I'm good. I will see you next week, Slavery by Another Name. We will take the history that we've described so far and see how it evolved into the next phase. And I would contend there was much more that we don't know about this next phase than the part that we've just talked about.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Sue, and thank you for everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Just a reminder that I'll be posting this recording on our Facebook page, and or not on Facebook page, but on our website. And so you're welcome to go there to see it. I'll send out the link to everybody who is on here. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Bye.